Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace, and thank you everyone for joining this event on reading the Quran in our times, which we are so honored to be hosting with the eminent scholar of the Islamic legal, intellectual, and ethical tradition, Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl. All of us who are participating in this event today, the speakers as well as the audience, we are all located in different places. But for all of us who are in North America, something we have in common is that we are all situated on land that has been indigenous territories for many thousands of years. There's Dr. Nader Hashemi in Denver, Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl, who is in California, and myself, Azeezah Kanji, in Toronto, which has been the territory of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga's peoples for many thousands of years, and was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt between these peoples, a covenant to care for and share the land. And so even as we are talking about reading the Quran in our times and the questions of justice that entails, we simultaneously remember that some of the most pressing questions of justice concern the very land that is under our own feet, and the question of justice and decolonization for the indigenous nations whose territory this is. As we think about reading the Quran in these times, we know that these are times of despair indeed. Scientists largely concur that we are in the midst of a climate emergency, and that the catastrophic climate and environmental conditions that were already predicted to lead to irreversible change within the next decade are not only not being pushed back, but are actually accelerating. We are also in the middle of an economic emergency in which this exploitative economic system that has been created has led to a situation where the world's 24 richest people own more wealth than the world's 50% poorest. A disparity that is only being exacerbated by the ravages of what the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty called climate apartheid, a situation in which the richest will largely be able to escape the effects of climate change, while the poorest, who did the least to create the situation, will bear the heaviest burdens. We are simultaneously trapped in the context of an extremely exploitative and cruel system of food production, where 90% of the world's meat is produced in a factory farming system premised on the immiseration, the torture, the cruelty of non-human animals. A system of violence that is now coming back to haunt humans through its contributions to devastating climate change, as well as the possibility of being the source of the next devastating pandemic. A short while ago, we marked the 75th anniversary of the nuclear annihilation that was rained down on Hiroshima. And yet, instead of checking the proliferation of nuclear weapons, nuclearization has instead proliferated so that there is now the capacity to destroy the world many times over. And in so many places of the world, from Palestine to Kashmir, from East Turkestan, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Province, to Rakhine State in Myanmar, where the Rohingyas live, we see projects of colonization and genocide unfolding brazenly in full sight of the world, while the governments that claim to speak for and be the leaders of Muslims not only fail to speak out against these atrocities, but in fact are making deals with and giving awards to the perpetrators. So these are times of despair, but they are also times of hope, as around the world, we see protests for racial justice, environmental justice, justice against authoritarian regimes unfolding, led by, in many cases, many of the very same people who have been most oppressed by these systems, many of the same people who we also see have been most marginalized in our traditions of religious interpretation. And so what does it mean for us as Muslims with responsibilities to work for justice and beauty in the world, to engage in a world in this state? And how can a renewed relationship with an interpretation of the Quran help inform these very existential struggles within which we are now engaged? We are so honored and blessed to be able to discuss these questions with Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl, whose many decades of work on the Islamic intellectual ethical and moral and legal traditions, born of a profound and deep engagement with these traditions, has been so important in informing our own perspectives and the perspectives of so many on Islam as a tradition for beauty, for peace, for justice, and for love. I will begin by inviting Dr. Nader Hashemi, who is the head of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School of International Relations and a longtime friend of Noor. I will begin by asking Nader Hashemi to deliver some introductory remarks on Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl, and then we will turn to some comments from Professor Abou El Fadl himself, and then we will have a brief conversation about some of the current project of engaging in a new interpretation and renewing our interpretation of the Quran that Professor Abou El Fadl is currently engaged with, and then we will turn it over to questions to all of you who are watching, inshallah. Dr. Hashemi.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to the Noor Center for organizing this event. I've wanted to bring Khaled to the Noor Center for a very long time. But this pandemic crisis has taught me that life is very uncertain, and there's never going to be a perfect time when all of the pieces of the puzzle will line up in the right way. So it's great that we can all gather here at this, very difficult and dark moment to listen to Khaled Abou Fadl sort of share some of his ideas on the state of our world, on his understanding of the Quran. Khaled has a very distinguished resume. I'm not going to go through it. It's been circulated. You can look it up on the UCLA website. In short, he's been a full professor at the UCLA School of Law for about 20 years. He's the author of many books, recipient of many awards. I want to introduce him tonight from a much more personal perspective. And I want to convey to you why I think he's one of the most important scholars and public intellectuals alive today who's writing about the contemporary Muslim condition. Now, Azeezah has just hinted at the contemporary Muslim condition. It's not an exaggeration to say that these are the dark days of Muslim history, the age of defeat, surrender, collaboration, humiliation, occupation, and subjugation. And the most, I think, recent evidence of this has been in this Emirati-Israel deal that received a lot of praise in various capitals around the world, from the genocide facing the Uyghurs in China, to the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar, to the horrific situation in Kashmir, to the mass slaughter in Syria, the war crimes in Yemen, the ongoing dispossession and plight of the Palestinians. Everywhere you look around the Islamic world, there's darkness, dictatorship, despotism, mass suffering, growing poverty, and pauperization. The coronavirus pandemic has made all of these things much worse. The forces of political tyranny, unfortunately, are very strong in the Muslim world today, many of them backed by Western liberal democracies. The forces of democracy and civil society are weak and under intense repression. From Rabat to Riyadh, from Cairo to Karachi, from Tehran to Timbuktu, the jails and the prison systems of most Muslim countries are filled to maximum capacity. And of course, here in the West, we're facing rising right-wing populism. And despite the differences in these populist movements, they all share one thing in common: a specific hatred and disdain for Muslims. I'm talking to you from Trump's America tonight. I don't believe the opinion polls. You shouldn't either. Mr. Trump has a very serious chance of getting reelected, and if he does, it's game over for all of us. So at this moment of darkness, when the prognosis for our planet and our politics looks very bleak and darkness surrounds us, Khaled Abou Fadl is performing a very important role by illuminating this darkness by virtue of his scholarship, his erudition, his Friday khutbahs or sermons, and his lectures. I like to describe Khaled as primarily and principally a Muslim ethicist, He's a Muslim ethicist whose primary intellectual project has been developing a theology of moral progress based on a human rights-centered interpretation of the Islamic tradition. I think what makes him such a powerful and potent intellectual force is his mastery of two intellectual and civilizational traditions. The one that he was born into, the Islamic tradition, and then the Western intellectual tradition where he received his post-secondary education. On the Islam side of the ledger, Khaled is a leading scholar of Islamic law, of Muslim societies, of Muslim intellectual thought. And on the Western side of the ledger, Khaled is the product of the Ivy League school system with degrees from Yale, University of Pennsylvania, and a doctorate from Princeton. There are many distinct qualities that I think separate him and make him unique from other Muslim scholars and public intellectuals, and where he has made, I think, a unique contribution. Here is a very short list. His principled critique of the toxic effects of Wahhabi Islam on Muslim societies, his penetrating critique of Islamophobia and of Islamophobes, his critique of Western foreign policy toward the Islamic world, his powerful interpretation and analysis of the many pathologies facing post-colonial Muslim societies, his principled opposition to despots and dictators in the Middle East, too many to mention, his human rights work. Khaled has the distinction of being the first practicing Muslim to serve on the board of directors of Human Rights Watch. And what I like about Khaled, and I think what makes him unique, is he doesn't just talk the talk, he also walks the walk. And what I mean by that, he's not someone who just sits in his office and writes intellectual articles and books. He shows up outside of the Saudi consulate in Los Angeles to demonstrate on behalf of political prisoners in Saudi jails. He does pro bono legal work. Every time I've approached him to sign a petition for some human rights cause or pro-democracy struggle, he's done so without hesitation and equivocation. He also has, I think, a contribution to make that has been completely unrecognized, is that in the age of rising sectarianism in Muslim societies, Khaled has contributed to the desectarianization of Muslim societies and politics by not giving credence to and legitimacy to, rising tides of sectarian discourses within Muslim societies. People also don't know that Khaled has paid a personal price. He's been subjected to assassination attempts, which is just, I think, a reflection of how important his work is and how certain political forces view it as a deep threat. So there's a lot more that I could say about Khaled. Let me just sort of end by quoting from his most recent book, Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern World. And Khaled asks his fellow Muslims to ponder the following question: how does your understanding of Islam contribute to goodness in this world? How does your understanding of Islam contribute to goodness in this world? And, Khaled says that Muslims must reflect on this question and they must strive to answer it. And they must be able to be open to skepticism, to criticism, to scrutiny of Islam's alleged claims to promoting human goodness. That if Muslims really believe that Islam has something to contribute, then they have to be open to being scrutinized in the court of public opinion. So I hope this introduction will whet your appetite for tonight's program. I just want to end on a note that I hope will be re-emphasized at the end of this program. Khaled has started a new project of Quranic interpretation where we're trying to raise money to help sustain the project. And we're looking for people to contribute $100 a month for 1 year to help sustain the project. This will be a new Quranic interpretation that is human rights centered, that is modern, and I think will stand the test of time. So there's more information about this on the Noor website, on the usuli.org website. You can email me if you're interested in contributing to this project. I think we're about halfway to reaching our goal, and we would appreciate everyone's help. So with that as an introduction, I'll turn it back to Azeezah and wish everyone a good program tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hashemi. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Khaled Abou al-Fadl.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Um, Thank you so much. Thank you, Nader, um, um, Professor Nader Hashemi, who's been a friend for a very long time, and thank you for to the Noor Institute. Uh, I'm so pleased to be with you here tonight. Inshallah, I want to talk specifically about um, the Quran project, which has increasingly become central in my life. Of course, my engagement with the Quran is lifelong. Um, Initially, your purpose is to unpack um, the vocabulary of the Quran, to understand its style, to make sense of the ayat, even in at the most basic level. But throughout this, there's always this risk that I think all Muslims who grow up with the Quran incur, and that is the risk of familiarity. When you grow up with a text, um, you're not always clear about what set of understandings, what set of assumptions, what conclusions that you think you derive them from the text indeed come from the text or from the various cultural and sociological glosses that society um, often imports to a text or imposes upon a text. In other words, for Muslims who grow up with the Quran, the risk is the risk of familiarity that turns into habit, sort of taking for the Quran for granted. The problem with this is that the entire story of Islam starts with this book, with this text that we call the Quran, that Muslims believe was revealed by God, is a divine revelation. And when you just think of it, and you pause and you ponder that very first premise, um, it's a monumental thing. Um, the divine speaking to human beings directly through a preserved book. We, of course, know about the Old Testament, we know about the New Testament, but the Old and New Testament raise their own set of issues that are unique to them, um, and in many ways are not parallel to the type of issues that the Quran raises. We often forget and we take for granted the idea of a divine intervention through a written word, a word that we all keep copies of, and we all have copies of, and we regularly consult, or hopefully we regularly consult. The idea of a divine revelation in our midst, God speaking, and God speaking not through mythology, not through just a historical narrative, but through direct, unmediated, ever present words and sentences that are accessible to every Muslim believer all the time. You know, you're free to open the Quran and read it at any time. Well, we also all too often forget that before that divine text, the world had not experienced what the phenomena of the Islamic civilization. In other words, the entire Islamic civilization was born out of that one book, the Quran. Everything, all the momentum that exploded from the time of the Prophet ﷺ till today was a direct result of that literary intervention, that speech intervention that we call the Quran. Yeah, as Nader pointed out, I mean, you look at the state of the Muslim world today, you indeed look at the state of the world, and I think it is even something intuitive within us that says, boy, we need a divine intervention. I mean, human wisdom has failed us at so many levels. The idea that divine wisdom is right here in our midst, but we somehow fail to take advantage of that fact, is a very serious concern. The all of that said, the reality is that Muslims, contemporary Muslims, have become increasingly alienated from the Quran, partly because the Quran has entered into a set of ritualistic religious practices that often obfuscate the need to wrestle with the Quran as a book about ethics and a book about morality. In other words, instead of having to ponder deep questions about justice and equality and equity and goodness, this entire inquiry is just replaced with ritual practice, as if ritual practice somehow replaces the need for ethical reflection. And it clearly doesn't. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you pray and you do a million rituals, but you do not reflect upon the ethical message of the Quran, you don't understand when the Quran talks about ihsan, what that means, or when the Quran talks about birr, what that means. If it doesn't resonate and move your heart and move your soul and shape your intellect, then all the ritual practice is for naught. It's one of the most basic things is that Allah repeatedly reminds us that the Quran was revealed for our benefit, that God gets nothing from our practices. Our practices don't enrich God and don't contribute to God, obviously. So partly the ritualization of the Quran is a problem. Partly we as Muslims, as a colonized people, one of the first things that happen to colonized people is that they lose their relationship with the word. Put very simply, in order for colonialism to achieve its purposes, colonialism robs people of their sense of autonomy and their sense of self-determination. That is just the ABCs of colonialism. And even when colonialism ends officially, colonialism leaves agents, these authoritarian despots, who teach people that power speaks louder than words. So now the problem was growing up in societies that do not respect the word and do not trust the word. Put again, quite simply, how did colonialism achieve its objectives all around the world? It taught people that there are no assurances that you can trust. That, in other words, when people tell you this plot of land is yours, that could change tomorrow. If people tell you this country is yours, that could change tomorrow. That you don't retain your autonomy and sovereignty and self-determination over resources, over the fate of the country, over the fate of the government, over even the fate of your family. That, among the legacies of colonialism, is that it teaches the colonized social hypocrisy and social lethargy and political quietism and a general lack of autonomy and lack of self-determination. All of that ends up alienating the colonized, and Muslims were all colonized people, ends up alienating them from the spoken or written word. They don't trust intellectual ideas. That's among the first things that go when people are colonized. They might trust engineering because it builds building or builds bridges. They might trust medicine because you prescribe medicine and people get better. But they don't trust ideas because ideas cannot negotiate with colonial powers. They think that beyond the empirical sciences, the only thing that there is raw power. Well, that's a problem because the entire Quran is premised on the world of ideas. If you have no use for ideas, if you have no use for principles, if you have no use for ideals, not just ideas, but ideals, if you do not understand the importance of the word, you end up where we are today with extreme intellectual poverty. Extreme intellectual poverty at every level. When we speak either in apologetics or we speak as parrots. We just simply take whatever the colonial powers have to say and repeat it ad nauseum, like parrots. That's a very serious problem. It's a very serious problem. And so what the part of the legacy of this is that, and you know, you look at Muslims since the past few, since colonialism, I mean the past few centuries, they haven't produced anything in the world of philosophy. They haven't produced anything in the world of ethics. They haven't produced anything in the world of political theory, social theory, produced very, very, very little in the world of economic theory. There are, and there is an extreme poverty when it comes to the world of ideas. And I think that's directly tied to the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of despotism. Our children grow up not as dreamers and moral philosophers or ethicists. They're taught by their parents to distrust abstractions, to they're taught, you know, among the first things we teach our children is that when we say inshallah, we don't really, you know, inshallah, we don't really mean inshallah. You know, when we say God willing, we don't really mean God willing. It's because of that hypocritical and paradoxical and sometimes even psychotic relationship with the word, with the word, the world of ideas and abstractions, which are so important for human moral progress, because humans don't progress through material accomplishments. They progress through moral vision as to how to use these material accomplishments. If you have material accomplishments without a moral vision, then you really don't have progress. Then we end up misusing our material accomplishments. So all of that is to underscore that in my view, the most important relationship that Muslims must have is their relationship with the Quran. If you take the Quran out of the equation, or a serious engagement with the Quran, I don't know what Islam or Muslims are about. If you take the Quran out of the center of the world of Islam, then we're just Muslims by identity. We're Muslims racially, we're Muslims ethnically, but not in any serious substantive way. And since Islam is not a race and it's not an ethnicity, if you take the Quran out of the equation, understanding Islam as a racial phenomena or an ethnic phenomena has no future. It's a failed idea, and it's a failed project that's not going to go anywhere. But yet, you look at the state of the Muslim world, and you only need the child to immediately recognize, if you look at how Muslims act in the world today, in what sense is the Quran central to their life? In what sense, when you see the amount of ugliness and injustice in a country like Saudi Arabia, is the Quran central to the life of that nation? When you look at the United Arab Emirates and the amount of human trafficking and sheer economic and social injustice that goes on in the United Arab Emirates, or when you look at the misery that is happening in Yemen and the way Saudis and Emiratis and Houthis slaughter thousands upon thousands of people, and you say, where's the Quran in all of that? In what way are these people centered in the Quran? When you look at a country like Egypt and the more than 100,000 political prisoners who are systematically and regularly tortured and abused and killed, and yet at the same time, you have Azhar in that country. In what way is the Quran central to the life of these people? You can go on and look at it, one example after another, and you really wonder, in what way is the Quran central as an ethical force, as a force that calls people to their conscience? In what way is the Quran a central power? If it's a power at all, even at the margins. What becomes very clear that the Quran is not even at the margins. The Quran is completely absent from Muslim life. This long life engagement with the Quran studying the Quran over so many decades, again and again and again, not only that, but reading most of the corpus of Quranic commentators written over centuries. I mean, I try to say that I could claim that I have read all of it, but I'm sure there are some Quranic commentaries in manuscript form that I haven't gotten to, but I've over decades, there isn't any major Quranic commentary that I have not read through. At the end of it, if we say at the end of it, because you're always learning and you're always growing, but at this point, I am completely convinced that when the Quran says something as simple and as straightforward as, this wise book, referring to itself, هذا الذكر الحكيم or الكتاب الحكيم, this wise revelation, When it says that it came to take people out of darkness to light, out of darkness to light, I am thoroughly convinced that the darkness that it is speaking about is not just the darkness of technical belief in Allah or disbelief in Allah, but moral darkness. And when it talks about light, it is talking about moral light. That if you are a follower of the Quran, there is no way that you can reconcile between being a follower of the Quran and starving people to death. There is no way that you can reconcile between a follower of the Quran and torturing people or jailing people unjustly and unfairly, or oppressing people and forcing these people to, instead of worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worship fellow human beings who see these human beings as the real source of power. But saying that the Quran is a book of moral vision and ethical vision is one thing. To actually understand what that ethical vision is and to lay it out step by step is another thing. A lot of people have made the apologetic point, the general stereotypical point. Yes, the Quran is a book of morality. Yes, the Quran is a book of ethics. But when you say how so, they can't really tell you anything beyond, well, the Quran calls for justice or the Quran calls for fairness. The project that I started years ago is that through studying the Quran, I became convinced. Let me put it this way. Before I say I became convinced, I wanted to understand, passionately wanted to understand, what was it about this book that moved the early generations of Muslims, the generation that lived at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the generation that succeeded the first generation, the generation that built the Umayyad Empire, the generation that rebelled against the Umayyad Empire, the generation that built the Abbasid Empire, and the generations that rebelled against the Abbasid Empire. How did these early generations understand the Quran, and what was it about this book that moved their passion so much that they literally went from a nomadic Bedouin people, not even on the map in terms of human civilizations, not even, with practically no civilizational achievements, to being one of the major civilizations that the world has known. What was it that intervened in their consciousness and intervened in their intellectual processes that transformed them from desert dwellers to civilization builders? And as I progressed on this journey, it became clear to me that every surah in the Quran, every surah has a comprehensive, coherent message. And mind you, a comprehensive, coherent, moral, ethical message. Every surah in the Quran has a beginning, has a middle, has an end, with a major, not just a message about believe in God and do good and get your reward in the hereafter or get your punishment, but an actual ethical, moral message for us human beings as we live, as we negotiate through life on this earth, To put it differently, Allah gave this earth to human beings collectively. And God made human beings the inheritors of this earth. God deputized human beings and made them the agents. We say vicegerents, and that's just a fancy term to say that we are God's representatives, human beings collectively, not just Muslims. That human beings collectively are God's representatives on this earth. We have been delegated and deputized to represent the divine. But God didn't just say, well, here you go, you are now my representatives on this earth. God actually gave us an instructional book, not an instructional book in the sense of a code of law. And that is one of the biggest mistakes that Muslims make. They confuse between the ethical message of the Quran and the positive legal edicts that they interpret from reading the Quran and Sirah and Sunnah and fiqh books and so on. No, when I talk about an instructional book, meaning here you have been deputized to inherit the earth, you have been deputized to represent the divine will on earth, but I am also giving you the Quran as a book of moral guidance and ethical guidance. Now, in order to understand that, the problem is that we raise our children and we basically give them little chunks of the Quran. Read the short surah, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Surat Al Ikhlas, read Tabbat yada Abi Lahab wa Tab, read Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil, the elephant surah. We teach them these ayahs from these surah, but no one ever teaches them, why do we have 114 surahs in the Quran? What is the difference between one surah and another? Should you learn the entire surah as a coherent, systematic discourse that has a major ethical point to deliver? And in what ways are these ethical points critical to the process of successfully inheriting the earth and representing the divine will? The traditional tafseer, which I've done for many, many years, and I have many halaqas doing traditional tafseer, goes line by line. It unpacks the Arabic, it unpacks the grammar, it unpacks the style, and it literally goes line by line, and it understands the Quran as each ayah, each verse, each line, as delivering a point that might or might not be connected to the one before it, to the one after it, to the one at the beginning of the surah, the one at the end of the surah. The way that we teach our children the Quran is basically, line by line, without any sense of the larger purpose of this book. And at this point, I'm convinced that this is why the Quran no longer excites our imagination. We really don't understand the Quran anymore. That type of passion that moved our ancestors, that made them go from desert dwellers to civilization builders, is lost. And as I went through in this process of studying, years of studying the Quran again and again, I became so convinced that there is a clear, systematic, ethical structure to the text of the Quran, and there is a clear ethical message that is delivered in every chapter of the Quran, and that it is possible to explain it in an accessible, in an accessible, comprehensive, coherent way to the average Muslim. And this is exactly what I started because, first, we did a pilot session where I started with, we did 5 surahs, 5 chapters. Jathia, I started with Surat Al Hadid, iron. Hadid means iron. So we did Al Hadid, Al Jathia, Al Rahman, Al Sajda, and we just did Surat Yasin. And when I first started with Surat Hadid, I wanted to demonstrate, the proof is in people actually experiencing it, in listening to the actual lecture. So I did Surat Al Hadid as a pilot demonstrative session to show what this Quranic methodology of understanding the Quran, and I try to demonstrate that in fact there is a coherent, comprehensive moral message to Surat Al Hadid. And then as we went along, I've demonstrated it now with 5 surah. In some sense, I don't trust anyone that claims to reinvent the wheel and say something like, what I bring is completely unprecedented. Humility requires that we build on the intellectual legacy of those that came before us. So in some ways, what I am offering takes into account all the commentaries that were made on any particular surah, all the writings that were made on any particular surah that came before me. But at the same time, you can't stop there. You go beyond that to show the ways that there is a coherent, comprehensive moral message to each surah, and the ways that coherent moral message is pertinent to our historical moment, the moment in which we live. One of the worst things that has plagued our ummah is that as Muslims, those of us who try to be religious, or in at least through their understanding of religiosity, become religious, often step back in time and epistemologically live in a historical moment that is long past. So it's as if in order to be a truly pious person, you must only be interested in what Imam Malik said and what Qarafi said and what Shatibi said and what these great imams said, while knowing nearly nothing about modern social sciences and modern humanities. That's not a faqih. A true faqih, in the same way that the fuqaha of the past, they were steeped in their historical moment. They understood the sciences of their day and age. A faqih that lived in the 12th century AD was well aware of Greek philosophy and classical philosophy, as well as the Islamic intellectual tradition. When I find some Muslim religious scholar bragging about the fact that they know the Islamic tradition and they know the old Greek philosophical system, what can I do with that? That's entirely useless. I mean, if you want to know, you have to study the philosophy of this age, this moment, the social sciences of this age, this moment. Your contribution is to speak to our children and our people and to say, here is the ethical message of the Quran, and here is how it applies to this historical moment, not to the world as the world was hundreds of years ago, but to the world as it is today. Um, the first thing that that you notice, unfortunately, about quote unquote shuyukh, mullahs, imams, those people who claim religious authority, is that as if in order to convince you that they are pious, in order to perform piety, is that it's as if they engage in these theatrics, this theatrical performance in which they try to portray themselves as coming out of a medieval moment. And that's disastrous. That's disastrous at every level, because look at, our children are turning away from Islam. They're turning away from Islam because when they see that, are you seriously asking our children to stop living in their historical moment and live back in a few hundred years? When you teach them the Quran and the Quran sounds like it's coming from a medieval age, you don't help them understand in what way any surah addresses their current moral challenges and the current ethical imperatives. um, you lose them. So in a nutshell, the Quran project is precisely that. And but instead of just talking about abstractions and theories, because as I said, we have learned to distrust words, because power has taught us to distrust words. All colonized people distrust words. Subjugation makes you, the first thing that goes with traumatized and abused people is that they no longer trust speech. They can't count on it. So the best course of action was to actually demonstrate it. And I would encourage people to actually just listen to one of what we've described as the new Quran halaqas, because that's where the demonstrative proof of that methodology, of actually showing what does it mean to approach the Quran ethically and to engage the Quran, translating its message to our present moment, to modernity, with all its challenges, and to make that book of God relevant to our historical moment, and understand its message as directly pertinent to our role as God's agents on this earth and deputies of God. So that's the Quran project, and inshallah, I mean, my hope, I've already gone through all the surahs, alhamdulillah, but it's just the teaching part of it that is time consuming. It's, you spend 30 years studying something, and then now you have to find the time to actually go through all the surahs, the 114 surahs, and going through 5 surahs, took a substantial amount of time. So, Ya Rab, Ya Rab, we'll be able to finish the thing.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your time that you've taken, not only in engaging in this process of interpretation, but also in the time you've taken to teach us, including tonight. We are so deeply grateful for it. In your talk today and in your work in general, you show so powerfully how the interpretations that are so often taken as familiar, as natural, as objective, as almost inevitable, are often rather instead simply the interpretations emanating from centers of power. Whether it's the colonial interpretations that were developed in order to oppress Muslims and disenfranchise and dispossess us, and yet we have internalized, or the male-centric interpretations that, as scholars like Amana Wadud show, aren't arising from any necessity, internal necessity in the text, but rather arise from the imposed limitations of androcentric, male-centric lenses that are applied to it. Or as scholars such as Dr. Sarah Talili have shown, the human-centric interpretations that have rationalized humans' exploitation of the environment and of non-human animals. And so can you talk a bit about how included in the question of methodology is also the question of the positionality of the interpreter, that the interpreter adopts with respect to these salient systems of power, and perhaps some of the precedents of thought and action that we can draw on, including, for example, the role of Black Muslim scholars in leading revolts against enslavement in the Americas, some of these precedents of thought and action that we can draw on to develop a tafseer of justice that is responsive to modern conditions of oppression, colonization, and enslavement.
Yeah, I mean, the ethical compass by which a human being approaches any text, but especially a divine text, is critical. I mean, an example of this, an example relevant to the types of issues you're raising. We know we read in the Quran repeatedly the clear commandment that worship God, worship no other than God, submit to God, submit to no other than God. That Islam, the thrust of the Islamic message is that Islam came to take people from worshiping, or to transform people from worshiping each other, meaning worshiping other human beings, to worshiping Allah and Allah alone, God and God alone. Okay. And we have this anchored in the Islamic message, and we read repeatedly that the Quran even describes that if you want to be in good favor with God, if you want to transform yourself in a position of closeness to God, that as a human being you should not hold slaves, and fakku raqaba, that you should give slaves their freedom. Now, if you approach this, we also, by the way, before I get to that, we know that the early Muslims, when they first received the Islamic message, among the things that became anchored in their consciousness is the notion of, I, as a human being, I'm entitled to dignity. So that when Muslims went to Abyssinia and they stood in front of the Abyssinian king, they refused to prostrate before the Abyssinian king. When Muslims were sent to the Byzantine court, they refused to prostrate before the Byzantine emperor or Byzantine political officials. When again they went to the Sassanid courts, Persia, again they refused to prostrate. And it was just elementary to them that, well, as a human being, I'm entitled to dignity, and as a human being, I will not prostrate before you because I prostrate before God. So there was something very intuitive and very basic and even very pristine about the way they understood the Islamic message as translating it as a medium of empowerment for human dignity and human honor. Now we come to modern Muslims and the way that they read the Quran. So, you know, you could read the same set of ayat and so on and say, well, okay, um, as long as you don't prostrate physically before a ruler, um, don't prostrate but blindly obey. Don't prostrate, but if a ruler orders you to kill someone, kill them. Don't prostrate, but if a ruler orders you to torture them, it's okay, you should torture them. This is exactly what happens in the Muslim world, right? Don't prostrate, but a wife has to obey her husband blindly. Don't prostrate, but if a husband tells his wife, you can't see your family, you can't leave the home, she has to obey. Don't prostrate, but a daughter must grow up obeying whatever her father tells her without question. Effectively, we've completely missed the ethical moral issue. Or what I see among some modern Muslims, unfortunately, they start saying, well, yes, it's true that the Quran said that it explicitly set out freeing slaves as a moral worthy act that expiates sins, that brings you closer to Allah, that however it didn't prohibit slavery, so we can't claim that prohibition of slavery is a moral issue. This type of moral ethical blindness kills the soul of any text. And it demonstrates, when Allah told us that that human beings are the most argumentative of all Allah's creatures. We as human beings have the power of sabotage. We can take any ethical book, I don't care what text it is. After all, I mean, lawyers are trained to make an argument by, out of thin air. You can take anything and present a counter argument. That's what we train lawyers to do.
That's where the expression devil's advocate comes from.
Yeah, that's exactly devil's advocate. The problem is that when you argue without ethical vision, you are in fact an agent of the devil. I mean, that's just the sad reality. And so when you look at the state of the Muslim world today, and you see despots using the Islamic message to legitimate their despotism to the extent, we've gone so far into this that now we have a major Muslim theological schools of thought known as Madkhali Islam and another one called Jami Islam that make the whole heart and soul of Islam obedience to the ruler. Blind obedience. So far so that a well-known sheikh in Saudi, said, oh, well, if a ruler assassinates Khashoggi, you have to obey. It is haram, it's a sin to even ask the ruler, why did you assassinate Khashoggi? If a ruler shows up on TV and fornicates in public 15 minutes on public TV every day, and he said that openly in a well-known fatwa that became very famous. He said, if the ruler goes on public TV and fornicates in public for 15 days every day, you still don't have the right to disobey or to rebel or to do anything but obey what the ruler tells you. When you turn the message of liberation by saying that when you worship Allah, you worship no other. When you obey Allah blindly, you obey no other blindly. When you say that rulers can only be obeyed as long as they don't disobey Allah, and Allah commands you to seek justice, to seek ihsan, to seek beauty, to seek morality, you've emptied Islam out of any moral content whatsoever, and it's become just a religion about rituals, a pointless, purposeless rituals for the sake of rituals. You know, no one is sure why you're doing the rituals anymore, and then we end up with this reductionist position. Well, the purpose of rituals is so you can have heaven at the end, not so you can understand, not so you can grow as a human being, not so you can flourish as a civilization, not so you can achieve justice or equity or any substantive virtue, but simply so you can perform the rituals blindly and then be rewarded with heaven. What type of human beings does this create? It creates pedantic, mechanical robots, literally robots, who are incapable of thinking, of imagination, of creativity. And when you take a human being and you turn them into an unthinking robot, lacking imagination, lacking creativity, lacking aspirations, lacking dreams, lacking rights, lacking any notion of dignity, by definition, that human being becomes replete and plagued by hypocrisies and paradoxes and inconsistencies. We human beings, once we are conditioned to be robotic, our behavior no longer makes sense because the death of the soul breeds hypocrisies and paradoxes that are irreconcilable and breeds psychosis. I mean, that's really what psychosis, the heart of psychosis is that you just have a human being that can't systematize the self, can't make things make sense for themselves and for others. And that's the serious, you know. So when we talk, Amina Wadud, you know, it says you read the Quran with an imperative, moral imperative of gender jihad, because it is elementary and basic that Allah wouldn't want one gender to oppress another. Not only is Amina Wadud right about this, but the very idea of legitimating of oppression of one group over another is so fundamentally irreconcilable with what the Quran is about, and in fact with what God is about, and with what creation is about, that it completely undermines the very logic of Islam. So if you are a Muslim and you are willing to accept the idea of oppression and subjugation and dominance and hegemony, and you're willing to say, well, it is part of the divine will that there are those very rich people who control all the power, control all the resources, control everything, and that basically can do with the earth as they will. And then what have you done? You've denied the very idea of human agency and the vicegerency of human beings. If 14 people get to decide whether the entire humanity lives or dies, then in what sense am I or you or any other person God's deputy on this earth? Then we're just fodder. We're just occupying space, and then we can't take God's agency seriously because all the power is retained by a select elite. Similarly, when God keeps repeating again and again that God created the heavens, the earth, the mountains, the rivers, the plants, for you and for your livestock, and tells us that all living creatures supplicate God, and all the mountains and the trees and the skies and the heavens, they all supplicate God. Then we approach the earth, and there's a well-known hadith that in the final day, every animal, every plant, every mountain that is destroyed without just cause by human beings is going to testify against a human being that destroyed it in the hereafter. Then we act as if, we're free to pollute this earth as we wish. We're free to destroy this earth as we wish, to to divert rivers, to exploit rivers, to turn. In Sharia, there's a great deal about the fact that no one has the right to control water or access to water or beaches or rivers or even natural resources. That these things were given collectively by God to human beings collectively, and that they should not become the monopoly of anyone. We again, we betray the heart and soul of Islam when we turn our religion into simply something about how to pray 5 times correctly, or how to wear your hijab correctly, or whether you go to the mosque and you correctly segregate between men and women. These are compared to the type of things we're talking about, like what you do with environment, equity between classes, equity between races, equity between genders. These things like segregation and all of that are petty things. They're, if you're going to go to an Islamic center, you should be talking about the things that matter to in terms of our agency as human beings on part of God. The things that really matter, not the things that are literally within the marginalia of the Islamic tradition. Nothing but the marginalia. Um, yeah.
As you said in this talk and also in your book, Reasoning with God, that as Muslims, we're attempting to reclaim our human agency in a political context where perhaps there is an unprecedented concentration of power within nation states that have unprecedented abilities to wield the means of violence, and transnational corporations that also have unprecedented economic wealth concentration, as well as controlled means of violence and surveillance. And so it seems that the epistemological project of renewing Muslims' relationship with the Quran is also very intimately related to a political project of social transformation. And so we have some questions coming in from the audience about what is some of the. Oh,
Can I
sorry.
just say something really quickly, because what you just said sparked a little memory. Years ago, I read the British historian Arnold Toynbee.
Mhm.
Arnold Toynbee has a short book called Islam in the West. And Arnold Toynbee was writing at a time that colonialism, Britain as a colonial power, was disintegrating and getting replaced by the United States all over the world. And Arnold Toynbee had a comment in that book, but that he repeated in several of his other writings, where he said the West suffers from a serious disease called nationalism, and if Muslims are infected by that disease, that will end what he saw as the Muslim threat to Western civilization. And you know what? He was absolutely right, because the irony is while Muslims have become ultra nationalistic, the West learned, and when you look at examples like the European Union, has learned that nationalism in its most in its extreme forms, like for instance what we saw was Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, it leads to very immoral results. So the West successfully infected Muslims with nationalism and perhaps modified its nationalism somewhat, although that the jury's still out on that because we're seeing the rise of ultra-nationalist movements all over the West again. Nationalism is horrific because nationalism oppresses races and monopolizes resources in the hands of nation states that act like tribal groups that are in irrational competition with the rest of the world, instead of anchoring the idea that as human beings we have to all serve, we have to save this universe together, and we have to save classes that are disadvantaged and in at a time of shortage of resources, because as populations grow and we water is evaporating all over the world, and water is becoming a most critical resource for entire humanity. The reason I bring this up is that if you talk about Islamic theology, I defy anyone to reconcile between nationalism and nationalistic borders and the theology of the Quran. You know, I defy. There's a difference between patriotism in terms of you love your homeland, but nationalism of Egyptians blockading the oppressed people of Gaza and helping the Israelis starve them to death. How is that consistent with the Quran? Saudis closing the borders to Rohingyas, and when uh, uh,
And many other Muslim states as well, leaving them to drown in
many
the sea.
other, and letting them perish in prisons and in these camps and die. Or can you imagine if Muslims have, instead of countries like Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries, taking the enormous wealth that God gave them through the oil industry, instead of depositing all this cash in French banks and British banks and American banks, if they even had a remote ethical impetus to benefit fellow Muslims from, in my view, when Allah gave the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, oil, Allah gave that to benefit the Muslim Ummah. After colonialism, Allah is like saying, okay, you guys went through colonialism, you guys were subjugated and dominated. I'm going to give you the tool through which you can rebuild yourself as an ummah. But what happened? What happened is that a few people, not even all Saudis, not even all, a few people in Saudi, a few people in the Emirates, a few people in Bahrain monopolized this wealth, obscene amount of wealth, that we have members of the Saudi family. I was reading this thing. One member of the Saudi family has $6 billion in Swiss accounts. $6 billion for an individual. And and then that money that went to Swiss accounts and French accounts and British accounts was in turn used to empower these multinational corporations that contributed in so many different ways to the genocides and against Muslims in places like China, to human trafficking all over the world, to the exploitation and abuse of natural resources, to the unjust world system that exists. This is really what just tears at my soul. How When anyone comes and tells me, I'm going to give you a lecture about how women should wear their hijab and stay at home and how they talk to men, I say, excuse me, before you tell me anything about that, I want to know about the use of natural resources by Saudi, or I want to know about what you feel about 100,000 people in Egyptian prisons. I want to know what are you doing about the genocidal camps in China. Maybe after we get through these topics, I'll listen to you about whatever you want to talk about.
I think many of us Muslim women with the pandemic, we are staying at home, so the men can't complain about that, but we are still active in all of these struggles for justice. But I want to ask you, beyond the question of nationalism, which you raised, there's the question of the nation state form itself and its attendant economies of capitalism. I think, a pillar of Orientalist discourse is to attribute some blame on Muslims, quote unquote, backwards conditions to inherent properties of our culture or religion, rather than these conditions of the nation state, of extreme capitalism, of extreme authoritarianism, which follow in the mold of Western Eurocentric modes of governance that are actually the source of a great deal of political oppression for Muslims all around the world. And so we've been having some questions coming in about the kind of grassroots work that's necessary to alleviate Muslims' colonial condition that we're currently experiencing. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, thinking about the tafseer project, can we engage in a tafseer project that leaves unquestioned these background structures of such as the nation state form, such as the capitalist structure of the economy?
They're two separate but interrelated and interlinked points here. One, the comment, as you pointed out, often Orientalist scholars and a lot of Muslims say, oh, we have to look at the way Muslims have failed themselves and the way that there are defective elements within Muslim cultures that perpetuate their own subjugation and their own oppression. And I don't disagree with this. Self-scrutiny and introspection is critical for any path forward. But I have it is important to engage in introspection as long as we are also fully aware of the historical moment in which we live. So let's say that there is an indigent Muslim movement that wants the Saudi monopoly over the administration of the Hijaz to end. Who has practically veto power over whether Saudi Arabia has total, unquestioned authority over the Hijaz or not? Well, when all is said and done, the Saudi government relies on the power of the United States. In other words, the sad irony is that who gets the final say as to the fate of the Hijaz, it's our American government. It's not really the Saudis. We can defy the Saudis, we can challenge the Saudis, we can create whatever international, Muslim world organization in which we want to say we want to change the fate of the Hijaz. But when all is said and done, it is the American forces that are stationed in Saudi Arabia, or, as when the siege of Mecca happened, when the Saudis called in French special forces, it is the West that consistently arms and trains the military forces and the security forces uh, and when I say, in the case of Syria, it is Russia. In the case of Egypt, it is the United States. In the case of Saudi Arabia, it is the United States. It is in the case of Algeria, it is France. And so all these Muslim countries have a military that is ideologically and professionally modeled along the lines of the cultures of the colonizer. And they, in turn, these militaries and security forces colonize their natives on behalf of the colonizer. And they do it in sometimes in very stark ways, as we saw in Syria, or we see in Egypt, where the indigent military is willing literally to slaughter, or the coup that just happened, the French coup that just took place in Mali. I mean, France, every time France wants to complete control over the natural resources of Africans, they just literally play with the military like pieces of chess.
And yet
And
media refers to them as a former colonial power in
which
Africa.
is completely nonsense. I mean, the French have continue and they do so often through their medium are these multinational oil companies that have ridiculous contracts in exploiting the natural resource of African nations, and these gross unfair monopolies, and the kickback schemes where they basically pay off African politicians so that they continue enjoying the privileges. But so first, we have to just be clear that if Muslims, for instance, start dreaming of bringing back the Khilafah, of having some type of Khilafah that unites Muslims again, we know that the ones who are going to prevent us from doing that is the United States and Europe. The minute you talk about today, you can't say the word Islamist or without it being an accusation. Are you a jihadi? Are you a fanatic? Are you an extremist? We are put in a position where we have to engage in an enormous amount of apologetics that we don't have energy for anything else. So then that begs the question of what to do. This is actually the irony of this is why I believe that the Quran Project is so critical. Muslims in the West play a very important and critical role because Muslims in the West are the only serious medium for moderating the colonial legacy vis-a-vis the Muslim world through their engagement with Western governments. When you have someone like Ilham Omar, or what they do when they enter American politics is they try to get the United States to stop being a bully of the world and to have more equitable, more fair, more just policies that treats people, natives, indigents, races, more fairly and more equitably. And frankly, as Muslims, this is all we want. We just want the countries, whether our countries are Canada, the US, or England, or Germany, to stop bullying the world, to stop treating the world as a dominating hegemonic colonial power, because it's immoral and it's wrong. And this is not what decent people should be doing. So and that moral project must come from the Quran. As Muslims right now, you get Muslims in one room, and the things they talk about, it has no moral anchor, no vision of virtue. Where can that vision of virtue come from? It can only come from the Quran, through the correct understanding of the Quran. When you understand that you as a Muslim, if you have any chance of making it to heaven, it's not going to be because you performs rituals correctly, yes, you have to pray 5 times a day. I completely agree with that. But what comes beyond that? It's going to be for practicing virtue, that when you cast your vote, it's a huge moral responsibility. When you cast your vote to an immoral person, so for instance, I mean, and this is real life, we had in the midst of the Muslim ban, the Trump administration had instituted the Muslim ban and had shown itself to be racist, to be ethnocentric, to be religiously bigoted. Even the Supreme Court, in its decision on the Muslim ban, conceded that the Trump administration was saying highly bigoted things, but it basically said, this is up to the legislature to reverse. The Trump administration it's not up to us courts. In the midst of that, you had Muslims, highly respected Muslims, highly influential Muslims, defending the Trump administration and telling Muslims he is part of your qadar, he is part of your fate. You should not protest the Muslim ban. I know of a very influential Muslim figure who told his followers it's haram for you to go and demonstrate against the Muslim ban. It, it blows my mind. And it blows my mind that these same individuals are still very influential among Muslims. And when you come and you start engaging them on the Quran, you discover that the kids who admire people who lack any moral vision or lack any, till now you discover that they're very illiterate about the Quran. That when you tell Muslims, I had this experience with a lot of undergraduates, you say, is it a sin? Is it, very simple question, is it a sin when we don't engage in practices that are designed to preserve nature? Are you sinning, for instance, when the way you deal with consumables contributes to the deterioration of nature? And they a lot of them don't think like, oh, is there haram and halal in this? Of course there's haram and halal in this. I mean, there's haram and halal in the fact that if you live in a city, within a city zone that, for instance, kills innocent animals, as Muslims, we should be active in saying, no, this is haram practice. You can't just execute animals and exterminate animals or mistreat animals. They are part of what Allah gives. To turn Muslims through their engagement with the Quran as literally agents of virtue. This is what Islam is all about. This is what Islam came. The reason that Islam, came after Judaism and Christianity. Judaism sort of became about the Israelites and God's chosen people and the promised land. And, Allah sent Jesus to say, no, you got it all wrong. It shouldn't be about. Then Christianity became about just accepting Jesus and salvation and original sin and suffering. And again, God said, no, it's all about virtue, people. It's all about your agency in this world. It's not about whether someone died for your sins or someone has a chosen people. So Allah sends Islam. Now, if we get it wrong again, then what? I mean, I don't know what else Allah can do with us when Allah keeps sending, try and say, get it right. I want you to live a virtuous life because I've created angels who's full of virtue. Now, I'm asking you human beings not to be demons, for God's sake, because the way what we're doing is demonic. I mean, when we destroy the earth and we exploit people and we have the inequities that we have, that's all demonic.
It's quite non-metaphorically shaitanic in the sense that it's asserting the superiority of one being simply on the basis of
Mhm.
what we're made of or who we are or who our identity is, and then
I mean,
assume a supremacy on the
I've
basis
said
of
this
that.
in the past. I mean, what was Shaitan's original sin? I mean, Shaitan told God, "I'm not going to prostrate because you've
Mhm.
created Adam out of clay and created me from fire, and fire is superior to clay." Racism.
Mhm.
So God got so upset at the
Shaitan was
Shaitan.
the original white supremacist or fire
Yeah,
supremacist.
sort of fire supremacists. And God said, I don't want this attitude around me. Get out of here. And he became Shaitan. So it's amazing. I mean, when I find, and unfortunately, I mean, as Muslims, we suffer a lot from ethnocentrism and racism. I mean, I've seen it kills me when I get these, because unfortunately I just get it too often. Someone who's going to marry a dark-skinned man or a dark-skinned woman, and then the families get into, they're too dark-skinned, and it creates a. It really, then you don't understand anything about Islam. Then Islam hasn't penetrated your soul. It has not captured your heart, because you don't understand that when the Prophet ﷺ said that all of you are, in the eyes of God, are equal like the teeth of a comb, it meant, the Prophet ﷺ meant what the Prophet said. And in fact, it was in his last sermon where he's leaving his last will and testament. So it's like, here are my last words to you. Here is exactly what is core to your faith. So please remember it. And it's very significant that the Prophet ﷺ chooses to emphasize that message of equality. And then, I don't know, you just get all these Muslims who somehow want to rob Islam of its moral energy. Um, and in so many ways, the entire Quran project for me is motivated, animated by a stern reminder that the entire Quran is about exactly that, the immoral energy, if you will, a discourse on virtue. Um, and inshallah, once it's completed, I think, I mean, because I've completed the study, but not the presentation. But if I get the opportunity to go through the entire Quran, people will see the Quran is one, I mean, is this, in my view, it is one of the strongest, um, one of the strongest treatises on morality and virtue that humanity has ever known. It just, from beginning till end, it is a discourse on human virtue and what is required for human beings to create beauty on earth. And this beautification brings humanity, or the more beautification you achieve, the more godliness you achieve. There's godliness and there's godlessness. And the challenge is to move your existence as deputies of Allah on this earth towards godliness. And that's the entire moral message of the Quran. But it is the as you study from surah to surah to surah, that's where the transformative magic of the Quran occurs. It's one thing to say, yes, I believe in beauty in general terms, I believe in justice, but to surrender to the transformative power of the Quran is magic. And to see what the Quran does to a soul that gives it the chance and listens to it is magic. Nothing but magic.
Your existing body of work shows so powerfully how, as Muslims, we have this beautiful, potent mandate and framework for working for justice, for working for peace, for working for beauty in the world. And yet, in the West, at least, even so-called progressive engagements with the Quran seem largely limited to this posture of apology and defensiveness. of having to prove ourselves to the very same imperial powers that are inflicting so much violence around the world, that as Muslims, we aren't violent, we're not all terrorists, that Islam can fit itself within the strictures of the world order as it is, rather than actually being a force for transformation. And so we spoke earlier about how we've so often naturalized and upheld as neutral and objective certain interpretations of the Islamic tradition, but also when it comes to other ideas about justice emanating from Eurocentric discourses, I think those are also naturalized and upheld as universal and objective ideas, even though we know, for example, human rights discourse, as legal scholars have critiqued human rights discourse as it exists, has largely failed to respond to some of the most pervasive structural violences in our world. Similarly, ideas about liberalism emanating from social contract theory, as the eminent philosopher Martha Nussbaum has pointed out, and others, also contain very serious limitations in their ideas about justice. Nussbaum points particularly to the failure of social contract theory to engage seriously with justice for non-human animals, with justice for those who are disabled or differently abled, justice for people outside our national boundaries. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how this project of re-engagement with the Quran, it's not only about reigniting Muslims' ideas about justice, but it's also a very important contribution to global conversations about justice for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, in a way that can perhaps clarify as well as push beyond some of the boundaries and current hegemonic conceptualizations of justice.
I mean, when the Quran seeks to energize the universe of virtue and morality within Muslims, that begs the question of, okay, who are you serving with this moral vision as Muslims? Are you serving just fellow Muslims, or are you seeking to establish a principle for all of humanity on earth? And this is where I mean, demonstrating this from surah to surah to surah is critical, because one, there are standards that are clearly enunciated in the Quran as innate and inherent to any human beings. So even a concept like taqwa, which is remarkable, I mean, even a concept like taqwa, Allah speaks about taqwa in the Quran as something that is not a byproduct of the law. It's not that you have taqwa by obeying the law. It's you have taqwa by obeying your inherent and innate goodness within you. So the Quran has moral standards that are expected of humanity, but then it has a moral mission that it deputizes Muslims with, that Muslims are supposed to accomplish for the benefit of humanity, and not as a tribal thing for just the benefit of Muslims. You point to really important set of issues. When we as Muslims we approach the Quran, and then we end up through our engagement with the Quran through basically an apologetic set of declarations, or an apologetic discourse that says effectively, just accept us as human beings and we'll be happy. Well, we end up, as in every purely apologetic enterprise, you end up achieving very little, other than just asking permission to exist. And the problem with permission to exist is that that permission is given or denied at will by whoever you're asking permission from. And that's exactly what has happened to a lot of Muslims since colonialism. So, for example, when there was recently, and I actually talked about this in one of my khutbahs, there was recently the State Department Commission on Inalienable Rights. and when you read this report, and it's supposed to have a full Muslim participation and Muslim contribution to that perspective, and you find that when all is said and done, religious freedom, and what that precisely means, because apparently religious freedom um, uh, uh, in no way imposes any limitations on the right to engage in Islamophobic discourse and the right to engage in racist discourse and the right to engage in bigoted discourse. But religious freedom includes the right to proselytize and evangelize starving people in Africa and um, people who have lost their homes and become displaced in Iraq and in Syria, to bring them to Christ or bring Christ to them. That's religious freedom. But the inalienable rights do not include a right to food, do not include a right to shelter, not a right as sacrosanct and as basic as the right to freedom of speech or religious freedom. And and a Muslim perspective basically say the Muslim contribution to that report was that basically to agree with that and to say, oh yes, where is the Quranic perspective in this? I mean, was when you look at the legacy of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet was consistently absorbed with the task of feeding all the destitute in Medina. That was something that, and we have so many stories about, and how often does the Quran emphasize the right to be fed, clothed, and sheltered? How often does the Quran emphasize this as something very basic as to whether a society can claim to be a moral society or not? But yet, the way social contract theory has worked itself out, is like, no, we basically enter into this contract so we can speak freely. But if someone is not speaking because they're starving to death, or in fact dies because that doesn't affect the contract. Uh, it has led, and it's all animated, of course, by what what was sort of the prevailing moral impetus at the time that people like Rousseau and Locke existed, the fathers of social contract theory, was that the West was obsessed with conquering the world and with property. And aristocracy was obsessed with retaining its privileges and proprietary rights. Um, and so we ended up with this bizarre thing where, I have the right to my property. My right to my property is sacrosanct, but I can enjoy my property while my neighbor is starving to death, and that's okay.
Or while my property includes enslaved Black people.
Yeah, or enslaved natives, because one of the things that just blows my mind till now. Do you know that when France colonized Algeria, Tunisia, um, uh, well, Algeria and Tunisia, but they also they've done a lot in Libya, although Libya was colonized by the Italians, obviously. Oh, but also Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. That during French colonialism, the French exterminated in North Africa about 20 million people. And to our very day, there has been no apology, no acknowledgement, not even a hint of, well, that was wrong. Then you come and tell me, well, human rights, uh, uh, but you want to rubber stamp, or you want to wave away, kiss away all the horrific slaughter that colonialism has committed all around the world against indigenous populations, against just the African uh, subcontinent by itself. It blows your mind at how much violence and ugliness was perpetuated against this race because of a religious myth about the racial origins of blacks and whether they're humans or not humans. I mean, all of that craziness. But the point is that till today, our morality has not come to terms with that legacy in any way and does not necessarily work very hard to guarantee that this legacy doesn't occur again. And that's where the problem is. I mean, why in the entire edifice of human rights that we generated, the right of the West to Christianize Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, a good part of Africa, uh, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, it, were sacrosanct and guaranteed. This is the world we've created today. But the right of native Indian Americans or the rights of populations that were decimated by slavery or the rights of populations that continue to be decimated by human trafficking in the diamond industries and in the rubber industry that feeds all the tires that we drive our cars on. None of that has been guaranteed. None of these abuses have been even mitigated, while we protect the rights of people to evangelize all over the world using under the color of American power. Because why are missionaries, why is it that you or I, if we tried to get a visa to Iraq, that's extremely hard. But if you're a missionary, you can use the offices of the State Department to go on a Christianizing message in Iraq, uh, or among the displaced population, Syrian displaced populations, or this is what I find so offensive, and I find so offensive the obliviousness of Muslims. How can you, as a Muslim, agree to a human right moral vision which is so nonsensical? That just doesn't make any logical sense. And it's so ugly. It's just the ugliness just stares you in the face.
I think we have time for one more question before, unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up. And so we have one about the dichotomy between this beautiful ethical message we find in the Quran versus this fixation on the minutiae that so often prevails. But I also want to add to that a question then about how we think of a vision of internal spiritual transformation beyond this fixation on the minutiae. We know that religion and an emphasis on spirituality, particularly in a capitalist framework, has been used to depoliticize people, to say focus just on your internal spirituality and forget the broader political struggles. And you've talked about some of this idea of Islam also serving as an opiate of the masses.
And reasoning with God, yeah.
Yes, and but I think we also see how movements for social justice that forget the question of inner transformation often end up perpetuating many of the same dynamics that they were purporting to replace, because you're just changing who's at the top of the hierarchy of power,
Yeah.
without actually changing the configuration, the internal configuration of those who wield power. And
The
so
morality of people. Yeah.
can you talk about how through the Tafseer project and through a renewed engagement with the Quran, we can come to a different understanding of that inner spiritual transformation and its very intimate relationship with the external work of political and social transformation?
This is let me put it this way: the Quran project is nothing if it is not, um, in fact, an engagement with precisely these types of questions. So, for instance, we haven't done Surat Noor yet, but Surat Noor, and I'm giving people a preview because we haven't done Surat Noor, but Surat Noor is fundamentally about the ethics of law. In other words, how to think about maintaining, or how to construct an ethical vision as you're trying to understand the role of law. That, in fact, I will go a step further and say that, for instance, Surah Al-Nur speaks very clearly about that law without a moral purpose becomes an agent of oppression and becomes a, a something defective and rotted. It's like, having a car that looks like a car, has seats like a car, but the motor is defective. It doesn't go anywhere. It just, stays in your driveway, rotting away. Uh, Law without a moral vision becomes a threat of becoming toxic and an agent of corruption, an agent of decay, and all of this.
Ironically, much like cars themselves, with their
Yeah.
contribution to climate change.
To climate change. I mean, so the thing about the Quran project is that I even will say that I challenge anyone who believes that they have a normal heart, not a psychotic heart, because if you're psychotic, I don't know what I can do for you. But if I challenge anyone not to listen to the message of the Quran and not feel that spiritual transformation that we're talking about, that it builds as you learn from surah to surah to surah what the message of the Quran is, it speaks to your something deep within your soul, and it gives you the methodology to continue working on yourself, to hold yourself accountable, and to understand what is expected of you from God as a moral, virtuous, as an agent of morality and an agent of virtue. So there are dangers, not just an opiate of the people, but sometimes religiosity grants people a sense of superiority and arrogance and entitlement. And like any moral philosophy in the world, you can take, even for God's sake, people have taken the ideas of Aristotle, was all about virtue and ethics, and somehow deformed them into justifications for subjugation and dominance and colonialism and so on. You can take the ideas of anything lofty and twist them, but as long as these ideas continue to be studied and understood, these ideas condemn their abusers. I mean, eventually, many of the ideas that were taken by fascist philosophers and theorists were the sources of their inspirations, condemned them as corruptions of the original. And so our relationship with the Quran is that first we must understand the moral message of the Quran. And then, empowered with that moral message, we can point to those who corrupt the moral message and say, you are a deformity. How else do you think we can point to the ugliness that we see committed by the Saudi royal family, or the horrendous abuses committed in the name of Islam by so many governments that claim to somehow embody the Islamic ideal, like the Iranian government, or you know, often even the Egyptian government whenever it feels like speaking on behalf of Islam, and it. But you have to. It is immorally conscientious people that can keep the idea alive. If the number of morally conscientious people withers to practically nothing, then you really confront the idea, the threat of the idea dying itself. And this is the real threat with the Quran, that we have with the Quran, is that as an agent of morality and virtue, when was the last time that we saw the Quran having an impact? I mean, when colonialism invaded a lot of Muslim countries, we saw people like Kawakibi and Khairuddin al-Tunisi, and here and there various theorists go to the Quran and say no to subjugation, no to dominance, no to despotism, no to authoritarianism, no to injustice. But after their defeat, we've entered into a long period of slumber, where every now and then you have a moral voice that pops up here, a moral voice that pops up there, but we've lost any semblance of a principled, systematic connection with the Quran, and that's what I'm trying to restore. I mean, I'm trying to make the Quran comprehensible with its clear moral message to the modern Muslim mind that lives in this historical period. And for those who want to see whether I do it successfully or not, all I can tell them is they have 5 surahs. They can sample any of the 5 surahs and judge for themselves. It's there, and that's why I did the 5 surahs, to demonstrate what this methodology is all about, and what this project is all about, and how we can have the Quran as an active, energetic agent for morality and virtue in our midst. And inshallah, I mean, I plan to continue demonstrating this, because we've done only 5 surahs out of the 114 in the Quran.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your
You're very
lifetime
welcome.
of work as a scholar and a believer in revitalizing these traditions of beauty and justice, which are in danger of withering. Thank you for the project that you continue to be engaged in, and thank you for sharing some glimpses of the wisdom from that with us tonight.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time together here tonight, but inshallah, this won't be the end of our conversations between Professor Abou Fadl and the Noor community. We look forward to future engagements. In the meantime, please do support this essential project. To make donations or to see how you can support it, please visit the Usuli Institute website, usuli.org, and the link is also available on our Noor website on the event page for tonight, and we will also be screen sharing it at the end. For more information on this project, as well as for other upcoming Noor events, please do visit our website, noorculturalcenter.ca. Most immediately coming up on August 25th, we have an event to mark the anniversary of the massed forced displacement of the Rohingya from Myanmar. And so we'll be having a panel of Rohingya and non-Rohingya legal, medical, and political experts talking about the situation, the current status of international responses, and what Canada in particular can and should be doing. So please do join us for that and continue to engage with our other events. And also please do visit the Usuli Institute website and support this tafseer project of Professor Khaled Abou Fadl. Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum and good night.
Yeah.
Let's see. Alhamdulillah.
Was it okay?
That was amazing. It was great. Assalamu alaikum, you guys. That was incredible. Hang on one second. Let me see if I can undo the headphones. I think that the hearing is bothering him. So one